So here's a question for you. Imagine a simple car accident. It's pretty obvious who's at fault. But what happens next? You've got a broken arm, maybe a missed flight, that leads to a lost business deal. Where does the responsibility of the person who caused the crash actually end? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how the law decides where to draw that line. Okay, stick with me here. This sounds totally ridiculous, right? A fender bender causes an alien invasion. Are you liable? But this crazy question gets right to the heart of the problem. You see, one single event can set off this endless chain reaction of consequences. What if your fender bender caused, say, a truck carrying a secret alien beacon to crash, and that beacon summoned an invasion? How far does that chain of responsibility really go?
And you know what? It just has to stop somewhere. The legal system simply can't hold people responsible for every single little ripple effect of their actions, no matter how wild or far-fetched they get. So to solve this, the law has a very specific tool it uses to find a fair, sensible stopping point.
And that tool is a legal concept called remoteness. You can think of it like a cutoff switch for liability. It's the way courts decide that a consequence is just too far removed, too disconnected from the original act to be considered the defendant's fault anymore. When you boil it all down, remoteness is really about one core idea: foreseeability. The law basically says you are only on the hook for the kinds of harm that a reasonable person could have actually predicted might happen. It's all built on a foundation of fairness, making sure that people aren't held liable for some wildly unpredictable, off-the-wall outcomes. So how do courts actually put this into practice? They use something called the reasonable foresight test. This is really the key that unlocks the whole puzzle, helping them figure out if a particular harm is just too remote or if it's close enough to assign blame. And, this marks a massive shift in how the law thinks about this stuff. The old rule, the Directness Test, was incredibly harsh. I mean, if your action was a direct link in the chain of events, you paid for it. Didn't matter how bizarre the outcome was. But the modern Foreseeability Test is a lot more fair. It asks a totally different question. Could a reasonable person have seen this type of thing happening? That one little change had huge implications. But let's get really clear on what foreseeable actually means here. It doesn't mean you had to predict the exact specific way things would unfold. No, the law focuses on the kind of damage. So for example, in a car crash, personal injury is a foreseeable type of harm. A fire is also a foreseeable type of harm. It doesn't matter one bit if that fire was caused by a slow gas leak or a sudden rare electrical explosion. The general category of fire damage was predictable. Okay, but just when you think you've got this rule all figured out, the law throws in a fascinating curveball. There is a major exception to this foreseeability rule, and honestly, it's one that catches a lot of people by surprise. It all comes down to this classic legal saying, and this is the key to understanding the whole exception. It means you can't just excuse yourself from liability because the person you happen to harm was unusually vulnerable or fragile. This is what's known as the thin skull rule, or sometimes you'll hear it called the eggshell skull rule. What it says is this: as long as the initial type of harm was foreseeable, let's say a bump on the head in a fall, you are responsible for all the consequences that follow, even if the extent of that harm was completely and totally unforeseeable because of the victim's unique pre-existing condition. So think about it like this. A small push that would barely even bruise an average person could cause a catastrophic injury to someone with a rare bone disorder. Well, under the thin skull rule, the person who did the pushing is liable for the entire catastrophic injury, not just for the minor bruise they might have expected to cause. Okay, so we've got the main foreseeability rule, and we have its big exception, the thin skull rule. But how does this all fit together in a real legal case? And why is this whole concept so important for making sure justice is served? In pretty much any negligence case, a court follows a very clear path. First, they have to establish that a person was actually negligent. Second, they have to prove that that negligence caused the harm. And then third, they apply our test. They ask if the harm was a foreseeable consequence or if it was just too remote. This is the final gatekeeper, the last hurdle for liability. So let's circle all the way back to our fender bender and put this all together. The damage to the car? Yep, clearly foreseeable, so you're liable. The victim's broken arm, also a foreseeable type of injury in a car crash, so yes, you're liable for that too. But now, what if that broken arm leads to some severe, completely unforeseen complications because of their unique medical condition? Well, you are still liable. That's the thin skull rule kicking in. And the alien invasion? That's where the law finally says stop. It's not a foreseeable type of harm, which makes it way too remote. When it comes right down to it, the law of remoteness is this really delicate balancing act. On one side, it's protecting people from this endless, unfair liability for totally bizarre consequences. But on the other side, it's making sure that victims, especially the really vulnerable ones, are fully compensated for the harms they actually suffer. It's all about trying to find that just and predictable middle ground. And all this really leaves us with one final thought. We all take small risks every single day. So knowing that you're potentially responsible for any foreseeable type of harm that comes from your actions, and the full extent of it for a vulnerable person, does that change how you think about your responsibilities to all the people around you?